All right, welcome back. In this video, I'm going to circle back to something I mentioned way early on in the section. I don't know if you were paying attention or if you remember. I talked about how component is just one way of specifying what content, what component we want to be rendered given a certain path, and there's an alternative. So in this video, I'm going to introduce that alternative, and we'll compare and contrast them. And I'll warn you now that there's a lot of confusion online between component and the alternative prop, which is called render. But before we get there, let's talk about props. Right now, about, dog, header, and contact, they don't actually use props, and we're not passing in any props. But let's modify our dog component so that below the h1, it displays the name of the dog. So let's do an h3 that says this dog is named, and then this.props.name. So now we need to pass in a name to our dog component. So back in app.js, how do I do it? It's not actually a component that's been instantiated or made yet, so that won't work. You might think we can do this. Name is equal to muffins, and if we do try that, it doesn't break anything, but React is just going to ignore that prop. So you can see it's not showing up here. I don't need to go into the dev tools to prove it, but React ignores it. It doesn't get passed down. So that's not going to work. There's another option. What we can do is pass a function into component, and that function will return a JSX component. So we'll return a dog component and then say name is muffins. It's kind of clunky, but it will work. And you'll see this dog is named Muffins. So we're now passing props into that dog. But I want to illustrate something. If I go to my dog component, this is going somewhere, I promise. I'm going to add in some of those lifecycle methods we've seen. So component did mount, and we'll start by just console.logging dog did mount. And then we'll do another one, except component will unmount, dog will unmount. And then lastly, inside of render, we'll do a console.log dog render. Okay, now let's go back to app.js. We don't really need to change anything. We're using component here, and every time we hit this route, we're actually making a new function, which is making a new dog. So if we come over here and I click dog, you'll see that we went from render to did mount, and then render will unmount, did mount. It doesn't really matter the order, but you can see that we're getting all three of those lifecycle methods, and that tells us that a new component was made. It's not reusing an old component. So that can be problematic. I mean, it works for us here. It's not really a performance issue, but I'm going to show you an alternative, which looks like, whoops, I did that too many times. It looks like this. We just replaced this component with another prop called render. So there's a lot of confusion online about these two, and I'm going to try and help you understand it here. So let's do /dog/r will be for our render, /dog/c will be for component. And then the dog's name here, instead of muffins, let's do biscuits, keeping the baking theme going. And then I'm going to add two nav links so that we have access, so we can click to get to dog/r. So I'll just put parentheses r, and then the same thing for dog/c. So now we have two different routes for dog. We'll ignore the header one. One of them uses component to instantiate a new dog with the name of muffins. The other one uses render. Both have a function that returns JSX. But let's see the difference. So we no longer have a /dog, so we're not seeing anything. Let's go to the component one. Every time I click again, even though I'm already on this route, we're completely making a brand new dog component. We're going through the whole life cycle, mounting, rendering, unmounting. Now, when I go to the render version, we still get those methods. Here, let me clear so it's easier for you to see. So we still get them, but now when I click again, it's just being re-rendered. It's not being remounted. It's not a brand new component. Instead, we're just rendering again. Now, if I go back to the component version, this one where we passed in component, every time I click, even if I'm already on this route, it goes through the whole life cycle. Now that doesn't mean that this component is never reinstantiated. For example, if we go to about, and then I go to the dog render, it goes through all those lifecycle methods as well. But now I click again, we're just rendering. Okay, so this is the key difference. Both of them will work. We're seeing the content we expect to see. The difference is that when we use component, this function is going to run and make a new component every single time. When we use render, it doesn't actually make a new component each time. It's referencing this component that we make here. And it's weird, it looks like they're exactly the same. We're passing in this function that returns JSX, but trust me, they are different. If you want a deeper dive into why it is, how it works, there's a great Stack Overflow post that talks about it. It dives into the source code here, and you can see, and I'll just go into it really quickly, if we use component as the prop, it is calling react.createElement with whatever we pass in. So it is calling react.createElement with a new dog every time. Here, if we use render, it's just returning render of our component, so the render method essentially. Now, my opinion, it's kind of confusing. The documentation doesn't explain it very well. They don't tell you what to use, and you will see both used in applications. If you're looking at apps that use React Router, if you're following tutorials, some of them will use component, some of them will use render. As I've already said, both of them work for what we want to accomplish. What I will say, I like to use component if I'm not passing props. If I'm just making a new empty dog, well, not empty, but if I'm not passing props, I like this syntax. But if we are passing props in, then I like to use render. But there could be times where you need to use one or the other. For example, you don't want component because it will call component will mount again every time you're on that route. And you may not want to call the code in that method over and over and over. So just something to consider. I wanted to wait until later in this section because it is a little bit technical and it's not going to matter to most of the things that you're doing. I will stick to using render whenever I'm passing props in, so like we have here. But again, it's just a personal choice. I recommend if you do have questions, you read the rest of this Stack Overflow post. So this part, this answer that has 31 votes, it goes into the source code, but then there's a further down answer right here with 22 votes as of the recording. And it goes into a lot more detail explaining the logic behind it, what the difference is, and when it matters. And I'll just highlight the last line. There is not a performance difference between component and render prop if you are using component directly, where you pass in a variable. You're not actually instantiating it here. But if you do want to pass in props, it's a lot better, or it can be a lot better for performance to use render instead of component with a function. Okay, there's a lot we talked about here. I'm really sorry if it was confusing. I did my best, re-recorded this one a bunch of times to try and come up with a way of explaining it. So we've got two options, both of them work. I'm gonna stick to render most of the time. And I'm gonna add some comments in here if you're looking at this. Okay, so I added some comments. These two routes are from the last video, this video. I just wanted to add that in case someone was looking at this earlier. And then I added that the component will instantiate a new dog every time, what we have here, versus render will try and reuse the existing dog component. But that doesn't mean that it's never going to run component will mount. It's never going to mount it. That does happen, as we've seen, when we switch routes from about to dog, or dog R. But then if I'm on dog R and I am clicking it again, you might be wondering, why would you ever do that? Well, sometimes you have nested routes. There are times where this matters. But for us here, it doesn't really matter if a user, they're probably not going to be re-clicking a million times like I'm doing here. But I just wanted to illustrate the difference. Okay, I'll be quiet now. Again, there are comments here that try and explain it. I also added back in our regular dog route and our regular dog link. So those are there from the beginning.